US sanctions Brazilian Supreme Court judge over Bolsonaro coup trial. What you need to know. A bold move from the United States has sent shockwaves through the global legal and diplomatic communities. US authorities have announced sanctions against a judge sitting on Brazil's highest court, thrusting the already tense political climate between the two countries into the spotlight. This extraordinary decision has plenty of people asking, how far should one nation go in judging another's legal affairs? But here's when it gets even more contentious. Justice Alexandre de Moraes of Brazil's Supreme Court is now at the center of international controversy. He is overseeing the high-profile trial of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who faces accusations of attempting to orchestrate a coup following his defeat in the 2022 elections. The United States claims that Moraes has overstepped legal boundaries by authorizing what they call the accusation. Instead of impartial justice, Moraes is supposedly acting as both judge and executioner in a politically charged campaign. In response, US President Donald Trump signed an executive order slapping a massive 50% tariff on Brazilian imports, framing it as a stand against what he views as a political witch hunt targeting Bolsonaro, his ideological ally on the international stage. This move has not only heightened economic tensions, but signaled a striking willingness by the US to interfere in Brazil's internal disputes. And this is the part most people miss. It's not just about sanctions, but about who gets to define justice and sovereignty in today's geopolitics. The US justified the sanctions under the global Magnitsky Act, which allows penalties against foreign nationals involved in corruption or human rights abuses. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent didn't mince words, declaring that Moraes is leading an oppressive campaign marked by censorship, unduly harsh detentions, and politically motivated prosecutions, including those targeting Bolsonaro himself. As a result, any financial assets belonging to Moraes in the US have been frozen, and Americans are now barred from conducting any business with him. The reactions in Brazil have been nothing short of explosive. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva swiftly condemned the move, labeling it arbitrary and a violation of Brazil's judicial independence and national sovereignty. Gleisi Hoffmann, a prominent member of Lula's cabinet, described the US measures as violent and arrogant, and called on the entire nation to repudiate this latest show of foreign intervention. Yet, within the Brazilian judiciary, there was also support for Moraes. A fellow Supreme Court justice publicly commended his work as honest and constitutionally sound. Now it's your turn. Do you believe the US was right to intervene in Brazil's judicial process with such forceful sanctions? Or does this cross a dangerous line, undermining national sovereignty and judicial independence? Some argue these steps are necessary to protect human rights. Others say they threaten the very principles of international law. Which side are you on? Let's hear your thoughts. Should world powers have a say in each other's courts? Or is this simply meddling under the guise of justice? US sanctions Brazilian judge amid escalating feud. In an explosive move that underscores the growing diplomatic tensions, the United States has turned up the heat on Brazil by imposing stringent sanctions against a high-profile judge at the center of a heated international feud. This bold action by the Trump administration threatens to deepen the already strained relationship between Washington and Brasilia, two nations that were once close allies, but now find themselves locked in bitter conflict. The new sanctions target Alexandre de Moraes, a Supreme Court justice in Brazil who is currently presiding over a politically charged case involving former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, a staunch ally of Donald Trump, faces serious accusations of orchestrating a violent coup attempt following his electoral defeat in 2022. The US Treasury Department justified its decision by invoking the Magnitsky Act, a law originally designed to punish corruption and human rights abuses abroad. But here's where it gets controversial. Applying this act to a sitting Supreme Court justice from a democratic nation like Brazil represents an unprecedented escalation. Under the Magnitsky Act, individuals sanctioned are barred from owning property in the US or conducting business with American entities. According to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Justice Moraes has allegedly spearheaded an oppressive campaign of censorship and pursued politically motivated prosecutions, including those targeting Bolsonaro himself. Today's action makes clear that Treasury will continue to hold accountable those who threaten US interests and the freedoms of our citizens. Bessent stated emphatically. While Moraes has yet to publicly respond to these allegations, his colleagues within Brazil's judiciary have rallied behind him. Flavio Dino, another Supreme Court justice, took to social media to defend Moraes, asserting that he's merely fulfilling his duties as outlined by the Brazilian constitution. Meanwhile, inside sources close to Moraes suggest that the sanctions may do little to deter him. One confidant revealed that Moraes views backing down as tantamount to surrendering Brazil's sovereignty, a stance that underscores the gravity of the situation. This latest development comes amid broader trade disputes between the two countries. Earlier this week, President Trump signed an executive order imposing a staggering 50% tariff on all Brazilian imports. A retaliatory measure prompted by Brazil's aggressive crackdown on misinformation online. In response, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva vowed to match the tariffs dollar for dollar, signaling no intention of backing down either. Adding fuel to the fire, Secretary of State Marco Rubio revoked travel visas for Moraes and 7 other members of Brazil's Supreme Court, along with their families. These actions reflect deep-seated disagreements over how Brazil should handle cases involving Bolsonaro and its broader efforts to regulate digital platforms spreading false information. Legal experts are raising eyebrows at the use of the Magnitsky Act in this context. Initially crafted to address grave human rights violations in Russia, the law has since been expanded under Trump's leadership to encompass a wider array of offences. Yet even seasoned analysts admit that sanctioning a foreign Supreme Court justice engaged in legal proceedings marks uncharted territory. Alex Prasanti, a partner at Global Diligence, noted earlier this month that the original legislation narrowly defined eligible targets, mainly focusing on perpetrators of extrajudicial killings and severe corruption. However, Trump's 2017 executive order broadened the scope significantly, allowing penalties against anyone complicit in serious human rights abuses. But what exactly qualifies as a human rights abuse? The term remains undefined, leaving room for interpretation and potential controversy. For instance, critics might argue whether investigating alleged misinformation constitutes such an offence. And this is the part most people miss. While the US government accuses Moraes of suppressing free speech, others see his actions as necessary steps to preserve democratic integrity. As tempers flare on both sides of the equator, one question looms large. Will these sanctions achieve their intended effect, or will they push Brazil further away from cooperation? Could this rift signal the beginning of a larger ideological divide between the America's 2 largest democracies? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Donald Trump's unprecedented attack on Brazil's judiciary explained. In a bold and unprecedented move, Donald Trump has launched a fierce attack on the Brazilian judiciary, targeting a key figure in the legal battle against his close ideological ally, Jair Bolsonaro. This unexpected development has caught international attention and raises complex questions about the intersection of politics, justice, and international diplomacy. Here's the explosive core of the situation. The United States, under Trump's influence, has imposed sanctions on Alexandre de Moraes, a prominent judge on Brazil's Supreme Court. Moraes is currently overseeing the prosecution of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who shares strong political views with Trump. By freezing Moraes' assets held in US banks and barring him from entering American territory, these sanctions represent a striking intervention in Brazil's internal judicial process. But here's where it gets controversial. Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, framed this aggressive action as a necessary defense of human rights. In a public statement on the social platform X, Rubio declared the sanctions a clear message. Let this be a warning to those who would trample on the fundamental rights of their countrymen. From this perspective, the US government portrays Moraes not as an impartial judge, but as someone jeopardizing the democratic rights of Brazilians. And this is the part most people miss. Why would the US step into Brazil's judicial affairs so decisively? Brazil's Supreme Court, and Moraes in particular, have been critical in holding Bolsonaro accountable, a process that polarizes public opinion both inside Brazil and abroad. Supporters of Bolsonaro, and by extension Trump, often claim that these legal actions are politically motivated, framing Moraes as a threat to sovereign democracy. Conversely, critics argue that the judiciary's efforts are essential to uphold the rule of law and curb authoritarian tendencies. This clash ignites a deeper debate about international norms and the limits of intervention. Should a foreign government wield economic and diplomatic tools to influence the judiciary of another nation? What risks does this pose to the principle of judicial independence? The move by Trump and Rubio's administration could be seen as a bold stand for global human rights, or a troubling overreach that undermines Brazil's sovereignty. As the world watches this unprecedented confrontation unfold, it prompts us to question the role of political alliances in shaping justice, and the potential consequences of international sanctions when used as weapons in ideological conflicts. What are your thoughts? Is this a justifiable defense of human rights? Feel free to share your viewpoints below. Do you agree with the sanctions against Judge Moraes? Or do you see this as an unwarranted attack on Brazil's legal institutions? The debate is far from over, and your voice matters in this complex and unfolding story.